The year is 1620. The Cambodian kingdom, once resplendent with the glories of Angkor and the defiance of Longvek, now stands dangerously divided. The golden spires that once pierced the jungle sky now cast shadows over a fractured land. Inside royal halls, whispers of betrayal echo louder than prayers. Rival claimants to the throne gather loyalists and steal. But even more threatening than the enemies within is the serpent without a Ayutthaya. After years of military conquest, Siam has found a new weapon: civil war. As Cambodia bleeds from self-inflicted wounds, Ayutthaya slips silently through the cracks, offering gold arms and promises to only one side. But the price of Siamese support is sovereignty itself. This is the story of a kingdom undone from within, while strangled from without. This is the hidden chapter of Southeast Asia's darkest diplomacy, where brother turned on brother, and Ayutthaya turned them both into pawns. Part 1. Fractured Thrones, the Seeds of Civil War and Siam's Shadow over Cambodia. To understand the gravity of what unfolded in Cambodia during the 1620s, we must look back at the long shadow cast by Ayutthaya's invasions in the decades prior. The fall of Longvek in 1594 and the subsequent wars left the Khmer monarchy reeling. Entire courtly families were abducted, artisans and Brahmins relocated to Siam, and the fabric of royal legitimacy was frayed beyond recognition. Even after the restoration of Cambodian kingship in the early 1600s, the kingdom was never truly the same. Power no longer flowed solely from divine descent, but from survival and foreign approval, especially from Ayutthaya. The once unshakable authority of the monarch fractured as rival noble houses, backed by shifting loyalties and old wounds, positioned themselves for control. Cambodia was vulnerable, and Siam knew it. At the dawn of the 1620s, Cambodia was ruled by King Chetha II, a monarch whose reign was defined by turbulence and uneasy compromise. His legitimacy, inherited from his royal lineage, was contested by multiple factions. These included the descendants of the Longvek royal house, as well as those with deeper ties to the pre-1594 order. Chetha II attempted to steer Cambodia through a narrow channel between Siamese pressure and the growing influence of Vietnamese power in the east. But within his court, many questioned his allegiances, and outside his palace walls, war drums began to beat faint at first, then louder. This period saw not just one, but multiple rival claimants to the Khmer throne. Some were emboldened nobles with armies and ancestral ties. Others were distant relatives of the royal line, brought forward by opportunists who saw in them a vessel for their own ambitions. Crucially, one of these factions turned to Ayutthaya not merely for moral support, but for weapons, soldiers, and strategic legitimacy. And Ayutthaya, under King Songtham, was more than willing to oblige. Songtham, who had ascended to the Siamese throne in 1610, understood the art of indirect domination. Rather than committing massive armies as Naresuan had in the past, Songtham practiced subtler strategies, sowing division, funding factions, and controlling outcomes from afar. Cambodia was a wounded animal. Songtham did not need to kill it. He only needed to whisper to the predator within. One of the most prominent factions opposed to King Chetha II was led by nobles from the former Longvek dynasty, who still held bitter resentment over the earlier invasions and the fall of their capital. Ironically, in their desperation to overthrow Chetha II, they turned to the very power that had crushed them decades earlier. Envoys were dispatched to Ayutthaya, bearing gifts, requests for aid, and promises of loyalty. In return, Ayutthaya would gain influence in Cambodian affairs, installing a ruler more pliant to Siamese interests and ensuring that Cambodia would remain weak, divided, and dependent. Songtham's court quickly recognized the opportunity. Support was quietly funneled to this rebel faction, not through grand battalions, but with elite military advisors, caches of weapons, and the symbolic blessing of the Ayutthayan king. The faction was able to rally support among provincial lords and even some Buddhist clergy disillusioned with the royal center. Armed rebellions broke out in several provinces, especially in areas bordering Siam, where local governors either looked the other way or actively supported the insurgents. King Chetha II responded with a mixture of confusion and brutality. At first, he underestimated the threat, believing it to be a routine flare-up of noble dissatisfaction. But as more territories slipped from his control, and as rebel leaders began claiming Siamese recognition, he realized the rebellion was being fed from beyond the border. He attempted to counter the influence by forging closer ties with the Vietnamese Nguyen lords in the east, even arranging a politically strategic marriage. This alliance, though advantageous, only deepened Cambodia's internal fracture. Many Khmer elites viewed Vietnamese support as a betrayal, a trading of one overlord for another, and Ayutthaya exploited this sentiment, casting Chetha II as a Vietnamese puppet to rally Khmer nationalists to the rebel cause. By the mid-1620s, Cambodia had collapsed into near-total civil war. Multiple claimants declared themselves rightful rulers. Some held court in provincial capitals, issuing edicts in defiance of Phnom Penh. Others ruled from exile, awaiting Ayutthayan support. Battles between loyalist and rebel forces became increasingly bloody and widespread. Temples were desecrated, rice fields burned, and entire villages annihilated for their perceived allegiance. The Khmer people, already weary from decades of conflict, now found themselves caught between competing armies claiming to fight for Cambodia, but each serving a different foreign master. Amid this chaos, Ayutthaya increased its leverage. Siamese generals were reportedly seen accompanying rebel armies, advising on tactics and directing sieges. Supplies and reinforcements flowed across the border under the guise of humanitarian aid. Khmer defectors who fled to Ayutthaya were promised land and status in return for returning with arms. In effect, Ayutthaya had become the invisible hand guiding the civil war. Perhaps most tragically, Khmer began killing Khmer, not for ideology or survival, but for the favor of Siam. It was not uncommon during this time for rebel commanders to present the heads of royalist soldiers as tribute to Siamese envoys. Loyalty was purchased with blood, and in royal courts both legitimate and rebel decisions were increasingly made, not on behalf of the Khmer people, but based on what would please the Ayutthayan king. The royal capital of Odong, established as a new center after the fall of Longvek, was now besieged by both rebels and suspicion. King Chetha II's court dissolved into paranoia. Advisors were accused of treason and executed. Buddhist monks were dragged from temples and interrogated. The legitimacy of the monarchy teetered, not from foreign invasion, but from internal rot. And all the while, Ayutthaya watched and waited. In the historical records, both Cambodian and Siamese, the details of Ayutthaya's involvement are veiled in euphemism. Official Siamese chronicles speak of supporting rightful claims and defending the Buddhist order, but the results are undeniable. Every faction supported by Ayutthaya grew stronger, bolder, and more violent, and every royalist attempt to counter this influence was met with even more internal resistance rooted, not in ideology, but in external manipulation. By the end of the decade, Cambodia was no closer to peace. Multiple kings ruled simultaneously, some recognized by their enemies, others by foreign powers. The countryside was scarred by war, famine, and displacement. Royal authority became symbolic, maintained through force and fear rather than popular support. And it had not lost a single soldier in a formal war, yet it had achieved everything it desired. A divided Cambodia, too weak to resist, and too entangled in internal strife to reclaim its sovereignty. Ayutthaya's strategy during the 1620s was not one of brute conquests, but of psychological and political warfare. Rather than seizing cities, it seized narratives. Rather than destroying temples, it manipulated loyalty. This was no longer the era of Naraswan's war elephants. This was Songtham's era where kings were crowned by influence, not lineage. And perhaps the most devastating truth of all, much of Cambodia didn't even realize it had been invaded. Part 2. puppets and pretenders, Siam's infiltration of the Khmer court, the civil war tearing through Cambodia in the 1620s was more than a dynastic crisis, it was a fracture of identity. Beneath the surface of royal claims and bloodlines lay a deeper wound, the country's sovereignty, cracked open and bleeding, exposed to foreign manipulation, and no power moved more subtly yet more decisively than Siam. From their capital in Ayutthaya, the Siamese court saw opportunity in Khmer weakness. Where once empires clashed openly with steel and fire, now diplomacy cloaked ambition. But make no mistake, this was still war, even if fought in robes rather than armor. After King Ayutthaya II's death in 1627, Cambodia was thrown into disarray. Although his lineage had attempted to consolidate control after decades of instability and Siamese aggression, his passing left a vacuum. And in vacuums, power-hungry men thrive. In the Cambodian court, rival factions quickly emerged. Some nobles supported the direct bloodline of Ayutthaya II, others backed distant cousins, sons born of concubines, or opportunistic in-laws. But amid this chaos, Siam placed its bets. The Ayutthayan elite recognized that internal Khmer disunity provided the perfect pretext for intervention again. Just as they had used Longvek's fall in the 1590s to deport thousands of Khmer aristocrats, Ayutthaya now turned its attention to king-making. This time, rather than marching armies straight into Khmer territory, Ayutthaya opted for a more insidious method: political backing. They offered military support to one of the Khmer princes, a young claimant with weak legitimacy but strong ties to Siam. This prince, likely one of Ayutthaya II's lesser-known relatives, had spent significant time in Ayutthaya. Some sources suggest he had a Siamese mother or stepmother. Others hint he was educated in the Ayutthayan court, exposed to their customs and language, molded to be loyal not to Cambodia, but to Siam. The idea was simple: help this puppet ascend the Khmer throne, and in return secure influence over Cambodian policies, trade, and territory. It wasn't a new strategy. European colonizers had done it for centuries. But in Southeast Asia, where monarchs were seen as divine, having a foreign-backed ruler was not only dangerous, it was humiliating. Resistance to this plan was fierce. Several Khmer generals and provincial governors rejected the prince's legitimacy outright. They viewed him as an agent of Siamese control and swore loyalty to an alternative heir, one born of pure Khmer blood and rooted in the traditions of Angkor. This rival faction set up a parallel court in the northeast, centered around what is now Kampong Tom. They raised troops, secured allegiances with Laotian border lords, and called upon memories of Angkorian glory to rally their cause. Thus, the civil war deepened. Cambodia was now split between two competing courts, one supported by Siam and ruling from the weakened central basin, the other by Khmer loyalists entrenched in the highlands and forested plains. The average peasant, already battered by decades of conflict, famine, and forced labor, now found themselves in yet another battlefield. Villages were conscripted by both sides. Rice harvests were seized. Temples were converted into garrisons, their sacred grounds trampled by soldiers. Meanwhile, Ayutthaya continued its quiet encroachment. Under the guise of protecting their favored claimant, Siamese officials sent emissaries, weapons, and even elite military units into the Cambodian court. These soldiers acted as bodyguards, but their presence soon extended to provincial administration. Siamese advisors began influencing Khmer tax collection, foreign trade negotiations, and even religious appointment series, traditionally off-limits to outsiders. It was a quiet colonization, cloaked in fraternal support, but its consequences were stark. The Khmer capital, though not Longvek, this time was slowly being transformed into a vassal outpost. Khmer ministers who questioned Siamese influence were dismissed or assassinated. Shrines once devoted to local deities were replaced with Siamese-style Buddhist temples. Khmer scribes were forced to learn Siamese script to correspond with their allies. Language, culture, even identity itself were being rewritten. The population began to feel the pressure. In regions where the Siam-backed ruler held sway, taxes increased sharply. Villagers were ordered to provide rice tributes not only to the Khmer crown, but also to Ayutthaya. Religious festivals now had to include ceremonies honoring the Siamese king. This was no longer mere support, it was domination. In response, the rival Khmer faction launched a counteroffensive. In 1629, they mounted a surprise attack on the Siam-backed capital, hoping to dislodge the puppet king and his foreign supporters. The assault was partially successful. Several outlying garrisons fell, and a major provincial governor defected to the loyalist cause. But Ayutthaya responded swiftly. Within weeks, Siamese reinforcements crossed the border, burning loyalist strongholds and taking thousands of civilians as captives yet again. Among the most heart-wrenching accounts from this period is a tale recorded in a royal chronicle. A small village near the present-day province of Pasat, where the entire population was ordered to bow before a Siamese general. When they refused, citing loyalty to the Khmer throne, they were executed. Men, women, children. The village was razed. To the Siamese court, it was a demonstration of strength. To the Khmer people, it was a warning: submit or be erased. As the 1630s approached, the war dragged on. But what had begun as an internal Khmer conflict had now become a war of identity. The loyalist faction continued to resist, though its power waned. Some of its leaders fled to Laos or sought refuge in the mountains, creating hidden pockets of resistance. Others attempted diplomacy, sending envoys to China or the Nguyen lords of Vietnam, begging for help. But international aid was sparse. No one wanted to entangle themselves in a Khmer civil war dominated by Siam. Eventually, the Ayutthaya-backed claimant solidified his hold on the throne, but only nominally. Much of the country remained in rebellion, and Siam's grasp over Cambodia became both blessing and curse. On one hand, they had achieved what they wanted, a vassal monarch ruling from a weakened court. On the other, they now bore the burden of endless insurgency, uprisings, and the hatred of an entire generation of Khmer people. The scars of this conflict were not merely political, they were cultural. Cambodia, once the heart of a vast empire that built Angkor Wat and ruled from the Mekong to the Gulf of Siam, now found itself under foreign shadow. Its court spoke foreign words, its religion was infiltrated, its youth were raised with divided loyalties, some looking west to Ayutthaya, others eastward to future Vietnamese powers. Yet despite everything, the Khmer spirit endured. In hidden monasteries and forest sanctuaries, monks kept old scrolls and oral histories alive. In villages burned and rebuilt, mothers told stories of Angkor, of Jayavarman, of freedom. Even under occupation, the dream of a sovereign Cambodia never died. Part 2 ends, not with resolution, but with a question. Can a nation survive when its leaders are chosen, not by its people, but by its enemies? Can culture endure when its temples echo with the chants of another tongue? The answer, uncertain in the 1630s, would come decades later, through more bloodshed, more betrayal, and an undying will to resist. Part 3. Ashes of Unity, Siam's final gambit, and Cambodia's desperate stand. As the 1620s drew toward their bitter midpoint, the fractured remnants of the Khmer royal lineage were locked in an increasingly desperate struggle. Within the walls of Longvek and across the Mekong basin, the weight of divided loyalties grew unbearable. Princes, generals, and mandarins faced an impossible choice: align with one side of the family and risk the wrath of the other, or remain neutral and be crushed by both. It was a chessboard soaked in blood, and standing off-board but pulling the strings was Siam, ever watchful, ever ready. King Songtham of Ayutthaya had no need for a full-scale invasion this time. Cambodia had become a weakened host, with its defenses undermined from within. Through emissaries, covert funding, and selective arms shipments, Siam tilted the scales of civil war. Their chosen proxy prince Ponhiatu, a pro-Siamese royal, was promised the throne if he could consolidate power. His rivals, including Prince Auti, and remnants of King Sri Chetha's lineage scrambled for alliances of their own, but none could match the steady drip of Siamese gold and weapons. Longvek, rebuilt after its tragic fall 3 decades earlier, once again became the epicenter of intrigue and betrayal. Its streets, once buzzing with merchants and monks, now echoed with the boots of armed patrols loyal to competing princes. Nightly assassinations and sudden arrests drained the city of its dignity. Even the temples became contested spaces, adorned with white banners of neutrality, others painted with crimson symbols declaring loyalty to a faction. Among the common folk, fear was the only allegiance that mattered. The Khmer Civil War, once a contained conflict of noble claims, had transformed into a proxy struggle between Siamese interests and those hoping to preserve some semblance of autonomy. Village by village, region by region, the loyalists and rebels clashed. Cambodian families, caught between crossfires, saw sons conscripted, daughters kidnapped to serve as political hostages, and elders beheaded for harboring the wrong prince's flag. To reinforce their position, Siam sent a limited but potent military contingent under the guise of advisors. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were veterans of the northern campaigns, trained in psychological warfare and siegecraft. Their presence was both a symbol and a weapon. Wherever they arrived, opposing factions retreated. Ponhea too, emboldened by his Siamese allies, declared himself de facto regent and promised a new era of order and brotherhood under Ayutthaya's guiding light. But order came at a cost. Temples were looted to fund further campaigns. Khmer cultural artifacts were confiscated by Siamese officers and shipped back to Ayutthaya. Inscriptions were scraped clean. Khmer manuscripts disappeared. Cambodia's soul was being bled dry not just by war, but by cultural amnesia enforced by foreign influence. Resistance slowly brewed from the countryside. One of the most determined oppositions arose from Battambang, where a monk turnable named Shiv Kem rallied local militias. His movement called not for the supremacy of one prince over another, but for the expulsion of Siamese interference. Let the Kheris decide their fate, he proclaimed before burning the effigy of King Songtham in front of a temple. Though militarily underpowered, his campaign inspired pockets of resistance across the western provinces. Siam responded with harsh reprisals. Entire villages were razed. Women suspected of aiding rebels were mutilated as warnings. Buddhist monks were executed for offering shelter. Cambodia's civil war was no longer a war for a throne, it was a war for survival. By 1628, the Khmer court under Ponhea II had officially recognized Siamese suzerainty. In exchange for military aid and continued control, Cambodia would send annual tribute to Ayutthaya. This included not just gold and spices, but also people. Noble children were deported as political hostages. Dancers, artisans, and scholars were sent to adorn the Siamese court and erase their Cambodian roots. This brain drain was intentional, weakened Cambodia's future while enriching Ayutthaya's present. To the Khmer people, it felt like a second Longvek, not one of swords and fire, but of chains and silence. Unlike the flaming siege of 1594, this conquest unfolded over years. It came not with the trumpet of armies, but the whisper of betrayals. A throne lost to compromise, a culture diluted by design. In the shadow of Wat Panam, an old scribe named Oken Haymin recorded his final lament. "We have lost more than land and power. We have lost memory. Our temples no longer sing of victories. Our children learn foreign tales. We bow not for peace, but because we have forgotten how to stand." That scribe's words echoed across generations. Cambodia would remain under Siamese shadow well into the late 17th century. Though rulers changed, the wounds endured. The princes who had betrayed one another for crowns found their own sons raised in Ayutthaya, speaking a foreign tongue. The civil war of the 1620s was not merely a royal quarrel, it was a Siamese strategy executed with patience. Unlike earlier campaigns of fire and steel, this intervention succeeded through manipulation, economic pressure, and surgical violence. And while the flames of war eventually subsided, they left behind scorched earth where Khmer's sovereignty once stood. In the end, Cambodia was not conquered by one army, but by many silences. The silence of monks who could no longer teach Khmer law. The silence of mothers who wept for sons conscripted by foreigners. The silence of children raised in courts far from their homeland. And the deafening silence of a culture made to forget itself. History often remembers the loudest battles, the great sieges, the thunder of war elephants, the clashing swords. But sometimes, the greatest loss comes from what is stolen in quiet: identity, dignity, and memory. And so, as we close the curtain on the tragic events of the 1620s, we remember not only the warriors and kings, but the invisible chains that bound a nation. The intervention of Ayutthaya was not just a political maneuver, it was the redefinition of Cambodia's future by foreign hands. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.